We probably already have a winner for the most disturbing and preposterous statement to emerge this year.
I think the reality is that for centuries we've really treated property as an individualized good and not a collective good, and we are going to transitioning to treating it as a collective good and towards a model of shared equity will require that we think about it differently, and it will mean that families, especially white families, but some POC families who are homeowners as well, are going to have a different relationship to property than the one that we currently have.
I'm Rich Lowry of National Review, and that was Sia Weaver in a resurfaced video. Zohran Mamdani has just appointed her his tenant advocate in New York City, and I want to argue this is the worst thing that we have heard from Zohran Mamdani or anyone around him over the last year or seen in any resurfaced video or social media post. This perspective that she's outlining here is so profoundly wrong and so destructive. And I want to go deep on why that is so. But first, let me acknowledge and then put aside 2 points because I'm not going to focus on them in this video, although they would sustain videos of their own. One, rent control is a terrible policy. It never works. It always backfires and fails. We've seen it in cities around the world when it's been attempted. We've seen it fail before in New York City. Two, private property sets in motion all sorts of benevolent, favorable economic dynamics. One, most fundamentally, if you own something, you have an incentive to handle it, treat it responsibly in a way you don't if you don't own something. It sets the price system in motion, right? I own something, I want to exchange it with you. There's a price at which I'm willing to sell it, a price at which you are willing to buy it. When we settle and come to an agreement, we've come to the fair market price for something. You get the profit motive going, right? I own stuff. I want to own more stuff. That gets my energy and my imagination engaged. And overall, when you have private property rights, you get a society where the most productive you get the most productive and efficient use of resources. In other words, you get a prosperous society, which is extremely important. But also, much more fundamentally, private property is at the foundations of our civilization and the foundation of our liberties as we know them. And I want to get into this. I'm going to depend largely, not entirely, but largely on a wonderful book came out more than 20 years ago called Property and Freedom by the late scholar Richard Pipes. Now, Pipes was a Russia scholar, and he came to write and think about property from his insight that a key difference between Russia and the West is that the West had a keen appreciation of property and Russia didn't. Now, property is a key theme throughout Western thought. To simplify terribly and rush ahead, you have Roman jurists arguing that there's an absolute right to ownership. You have theologians like Aquinas, perhaps grudgingly, but acknowledging there's a right to property plays into their view of what justice is. Then you have Protestant reformers like Luther and Calvin, who are much more into the notion of private property. And then you have jurists like Jean Bowden, like Hugo Grotius, who play into this key development in Western thought that there is a natural law that is immutable. And part of that natural law is a right to property that the state can't violate. Okay, excited yet? What I've just described is a really important development, but it's about to get bigger and better because we're about to go to the granddaddy of them all, John Locke. Now, what Locke does is argue that the reason we left the state of nature was to protect our property. And he has a really capacious understanding of property. Property is not just my desk here where I'm sitting. It's not just my computer that I have in front of me. It is my labor. It is myself. Though the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with, and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. As Locke put it elsewhere, we have a right to life, liberties, and estates. Now, boom, right there. That is the notion that gives us rights as we know them in Western civilization. Because if you have a property right to your liberties, then they can't be taken away. And there are all sorts of implications from that have created our civilization as we know it. And typically, no one said it better than James Madison. He wrote how, in one sense, you just own external things. In another sense, you own your rights. And then he goes on to write, in the former sense, a man's land or merchandise or money is called as property. In the latter sense, a man has property in his opinions and the free communication of them. He has a property of peculiar value in his religious opinions and the profession and practice dictated by them. He has property very dear to him in the safety and liberty of his person. He has an equal property in the free use of his faculties and free choice of the objects on which to employ them. In a word, as a man is said to have a right to his property, he may be equally said to have a property in his rights. Now, these just weren't ideas. They were also practices that became institutions, but they were very much contested. Another implication of this view of property is that if you own something, no one has a right to take it from you, including the government, including in the form of taxes. So from that, we get the notion of no taxation without representation. And this idea is a matter of dispute and conflict in Anglo-America for quite a long time. It's fought out in the English Civil War. It's fought out in the Glorious Revolution, and it's ultimately fought out, most importantly, in the American Revolution. And this is why the likes of James Madison matters so much, because he wasn't just a thinker and an analyst. He was a practitioner, because the American Revolution gave him and other founders the opportunity to affect their vision in the American Republic. But there is very much a counter tradition to all this, arising, like many terrible and unworthy things, from the French Revolution. In the Revolution, you see the rise of radicals and revolutionary socialists, the likes of the so-called Gracchus Babeuf, who didn't have the same view of equality as a John Locke. John Locke believed in equality of opportunity. Babeuf believed in equality of results and thought they had to be affected in communal ownership. We aim at common property, or the community of goods. No more individual property in lands. The earth belongs to no one. The fruits belong to all. This is the tradition that a C.O. Weaver belongs to. We get a very arresting and famous formulation of it a little later. Anarchist and socialist thinker Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who says, what is property? It is theft. The Bolsheviks pick up on this idea and implement it during the revolution with the slogan, loot the loot. Amazingly enough, this is where C.O. Weaver is coming from, right? When she talks about, as she has in the past, about seizing private property. And then there's a DEI element added in, whereas she says she thinks that private property and home ownership are instruments of white supremacy, which is completely insane. Whatever the nation's past sins, everyone wants to own property, and everyone can own property in America. Home ownership is a universal aspiration, and I don't care whether you own the smallest postage stamp size lawn in Watts or the biggest mansion in Bel Air. You were vested in that property in a Lockean sense. It is yours. This is a dynamic, by the way, that just is a fundamental part of human nature. In societies that seek to crush it, that seek to replace it with something different, always inevitably fail. They wreck themselves and immiserate millions of people. And just a small symptom of this dynamic is the kind of rent control that C.O. Weaver advocates for. It trashed New York City in the 1970s. Now, besides being ignorant of the economics involved, she views these kind of policies as an instrument of racial justice, a form of reparations. Her attitude bears a similarity to those of Zimbabwe when they were expropriating white farmers, or what radicals in South Africa want to do today to white farmers. In this connection, it's very notable that Mamdani, in his inaugural address, favorably cited the example of South Africa. It's impossible to exaggerate the radicalness of this vision. It rejects the building blocks of a successful society. It rejects the building blocks of Western civilization. It rejects the building blocks of our liberties. If you'll indulge me, let's go again to our friend Richard Pipes. The right to property in and of itself does not guarantee civil rights and liberties, but historically speaking, it has been the single most effective device for ensuring both, because it creates an autonomous sphere in which, by mutual consent, neither the state nor society can encroach. By drawing a line between the public and the private, it makes the owner co-sovereign, as it were. Hence, it is arguably more important than the right to vote. There's real wisdom in that, but ignorant haters like Zohran Mamdani and the people around him will never realize it, to New York City's peril. I'm Rich Lowry, over and out.